Good evening, everybody, and welcome back. Here we are, our final class. When we supposed to be upset, not excited about that. When we take a look back at our time together over the past few months, it may seem like we've thrown a lot of new problems your way. The algorithms are racist, killer robots are on the loose, democracy is imperiled, our policymakers are technologically clueless, and corporations have all of your data. Thanks for coming. See you next year. Strangely, it also may seem like many of these new problems we've explored aren't all that unprecedented. Same story, different day. Companies have to trade off profits and values. Governments have to wrestle with new facts on the ground. And philosophers are asking big questions about what all this change means for our society and for the world. Mark Twain once described something like this version of the story. "There's no such thing as a new idea," he said in his autobiography. "It's impossible. We simply take a lot of old ideas and we put them into a sort of mental kaleidoscope. We give them a turn and they make new and curious combinations. We keep on turning and making new combinations indefinitely, but they're the same old pieces of colored glass that have been in use through all the ages." The kaleidoscope that we focused on in here may be powered by more efficient algorithms and more powerful engineers than the manual ones that came before, but the pieces of colored glass it is rearranging so profoundly are in fact ones that represent the most timeless and fundamental of human values: fairness, privacy, security, agency, autonomy, and progress. Now, to be clear, even if the problems we face aren't all new, that doesn't mean they're not urgent. It doesn't mean that the solutions generations past have dreamt up in response to similar situations will necessarily apply. And it certainly doesn't mean that the real lives they affect don't deserve our best efforts to grapple with the transformations underway. In each of our conversations, we've heard from a range of experts representing organizations, companies, and political institutions. Each made their strongest case for how to seize the opportunities and address the threats now on the horizon. We hope that out of these conversations, you're walking away with something that transcends the particulars of specific technologies, a set of perspectives with which to view the impact of technology on society and to evaluate the competing proposals about how best to respond to it. So when you hear Elizabeth Warren campaigning in the upcoming presidential election, as she's already begun to, on a promise to break up the big tech companies, you'll do so with an ear that acknowledges the benefits of her proposal, perhaps a healthier competitive environment for new startups, or less concentration of power in the hands of a few companies, but also its risks: less functional products, a possible increase in the number of unaccountable tech firms, including some from places in the world that may not share your values. And then when Ted Cruz, about as far away politically from Elizabeth Warren as one can get, publicly champions her proposal as well, saying big tech is a serious threat to our democracy, you'll be able to sympathize with his worries about the consequences of public discourse mediated by a handful of corporations, but also maintain a sense of perspective about what big tech can or should even accomplish when it comes to things like ensuring unbridled free expression or privacy in all places and all times. And finally, when you see Donald Trump tweeting, as he did this week, that computer scientists are, quote, always seeking to go one unnecessary step further, when often old and simpler is far better. Or that, quote, complexity creates danger for great cost, yet very little gain. You'll read these pronouncements with some nuance. Maybe halting technological progress would result in less job displacement or anxiety about a changing world. But slowing technical development could also signal a tragic admission. An admission that we no longer wish to push the boundaries of possibility, or that we don't believe we can do so and also preserve a society worth living in. In the end, what we're seeking is a delicate balance, one that in many ways remains elusive. To maintain the innovation and curiosity at the heart of technological progress, while also guaranteeing dignity for those on the other side of that progress and a stable democratic system in which it can flourish. In our final session tonight, we're hoping to do a couple of different things. First, we want to examine some elements that have been lurking in the background of our conversations, but not always made explicit: the culture and values of Silicon Valley. We'll begin with an honest reflection about who makes up the technology industry, an industry that famously considers itself a meritocracy, and yet offers no shortage of reasons to question what role merit is actually playing in who gets hired or funded or celebrated. After all, even taking into account recent improvements, over 80% of tech executives are white and an overwhelming majority male. Women account for just a quarter of employees across the industry, and women-led companies receive just 2% of VC funding. According to Google's latest diversity report, attrition rates for Black and Latinx employees far exceed those of other groups. The lack of representation among women and people of color in the industry is only exacerbated by a culture of sexual harassment, unequal pay and promotions, and the inability to obtain the informal mentorship that makes it possible to climb corporate ladders. And beyond gender or racial diversity, there are genuine questions about Silicon Valley's tolerance for viewpoints that contradict its own default social and ideological orientation. These concerns matter not merely because we seek to have an industry that represents society at large, but because the people designing and advancing technology bring with them their own visions of what problems are worth solving and what products are worth building. In other words, culture is about more than who's in the room. We should be equally concerned about the customs, norms, and values that define Silicon Valley, and perhaps especially about the relationship between those values and the ever-present need to monetize new products and services. So should we expect companies to optimize for something other than profit? Should we even want them to? Or should checking that impulse be the work of other institutions, of governments, civil society, or of citizens? These broader questions lead us into our second task here tonight, which is to revisit some of the cross-cutting themes and questions that have emerged from the full set of conversations to date. Questions about governance and power, about the relationship between technology and democracy, and about how technology companies based in America should wield their power in a globally connected world. Reconsidering these themes gives us the chance to close the class in the same way we opened it, by talking about the unique political moment we inhabit, about the increase of scrutiny and pushback we're witnessing with respect to technological change. But the question remains, is growing concern about tech primed to unleash a wave of sweeping and significant reform? Or are we simply resigned to living with a perpetual state of anxiety about tech, even as the fundamental political issues it raises go unaddressed? Amidst much uncertainty, one thing is for sure. Making progress on any of these questions demands that we keep paying close attention to the issues that give rise to them. And it will require a willingness to approach hard societal problems in conditions that are far from perfect. The facts are changing in real time. Normal alignments of sectors and nations seem out of whack, and the real lives of people are now at stake. So as we conclude our time together, we're joined by three people with wide-ranging interests and experiences relevant to this class. First, we have Brian Acton, who is the executive chairman and CEO of the Signal Foundation, which he co-founded in 2018. Prior to this, he co-founded WhatsApp, a messaging app with over 1 billion users, which was acquired by Facebook for $19 billion. He left in 2017 in no small part over concerns about privacy and the company's strategy to monetize the service. And he's been focused since on ensuring privacy and data protection for people around the globe. Then we have Elora Israni. She is a JD candidate at Harvard Law School, where she's interested in the impact of technology on our criminal legal system and has written on the use of risk assessment algorithms like those we discussed a few months back. She's also the co-founder of an organization called She++ that works to address gender, racial, and socioeconomic diversity in the tech industry. Laura previously worked as a software engineer at Facebook on the civic engagement products team. And finally, we have David Siegel, who is a computer scientist, entrepreneur, and philanthropist. He co-founded 2 Sigma Investments, where he currently serves as co-chairman, which is a hedge fund powered by AI and advanced data science techniques. David received a PhD in computer science from MIT and supports a range of organizations and leaders that will understand and shape the impact of technology on society. So thank you for paying attention for the past few months alongside us, and please join me in welcoming everyone to the stage.
All right, I'm going to get us started with the questions tonight. And Hillary mentioned the astonishing Trump tweet about the devilish MIT computer scientists who are automating airplanes and the problems with people who are racing ahead of the possibility of human-piloted aircraft. I want to bring in with something else ripped from the headlines in order to address a question about the culture of Silicon Valley. And it gets at what might be thought to be the beating heart of the culture of Silicon Valley, which is Stanford University. So in the news, of course, is the scandal of college admissions that has touched Stanford as well, that it turns out there's not merely a back door to get into Stanford, but a number of side doors as well. Putting the lie to the idea that our institutions of higher education are bastions of meritocracy, that they look across the entire world for talent wherever it rests. They affirmatively reach out to try to cultivate people into the applicant pool, which numbers in the 50s and 60,000s here at Stanford, and only take the very best people, offering them need-blind admission, even in many cases. So meritocracy has long thought to be at the heart of any worthy system of higher education, especially a selective university. And that's also been thought to be at the heart of Silicon Valley, that you could be an engineer or coder these days taking, as long as you have an internet connection, a kind of free online class and develop some coding skills. Come to Silicon Valley, where the social capital throbs with the ideas of other coders and other similarly motivated people, a magnet of talent across the world, so long as you are talented. Now, I want to begin just by asking whether or not one of the features of Silicon Valley is really a meritocratic place. And I'll of course acknowledge by saying there is no place that's a crystalline perfect meritocracy. So it's obvious that neither Silicon Valley nor Stanford is perfectly meritocratic. But it's long been a calling card of Silicon Valley, a calling card certainly of the university. And for some of the reasons that Hillary shared, just with descriptive statistics about the number of minorities and women who are hired, the numbers who are, of companies that are funded, and people who are in the employee base, et cetera, it seems hard to square meritocracy with the descriptive statistics. So I just wanted to start there. David, since you're based in New York, maybe we'll let you chime in insofar as you think about this from an engineering perspective, but comment on Silicon Valley too. Brian or Elora, meritocracy. Is it a specter, or is there really something to this idea?
I don't think Silicon Valley is a meritocracy. I don't think Stanford is a meritocracy. I don't think Harvard, where I go, is a meritocracy. I think that people like me who get to work at Facebook and go to Stanford and go to Harvard, for the most part, have an incredible amount of privilege, and that's how we get there. And I think what Silicon Valley does very, very well is sell this myth, sell this kind of American dream. Anyone can teach themselves to code and get a job in Silicon Valley and make a bunch of money or found a company and be, a billionaire. And that is a very dangerous myth, because what it teaches us is that when you don't succeed in Silicon Valley, it is because you are unintelligent, you screwed up, it is your fault, and there is nothing about this system that has caused you to fail when people who have privilege succeeded. And so I think in the same way that the United States and the world is not a meritocracy, Silicon Valley is not, but it does a very good job of selling this myth and selling it well.
And I think I'd say that I'm a testament to I'm a product of that myth, right? So growing up in Central Florida in the late 80s, for me it was get the best grades you can get the best test scores you can get, and you'll get into a good college. And so that's how I got into Stanford in 1991. And buying into the Silicon Valley ecosystem and buying into that meritocracy, I loved the fact that you could go work at a company, you could wear shorts, you could do all those things, and it was the idea of it was the quality of your ideas, how well you performed, that really drew me to this place. And I'm ultimately the poster child of success, right? I went through the system, they turned the crank, and they spit out a billionaire. I'll admit it. I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's the truth. It's just that I think, as Laura alludes to, there are the downsides of this. That people do get left behind. People, very few people win the lottery. Very few people get struck by lightning. I'm one of the lucky ones, for sure.
One more pass at this, and again, David, if you want to comment here, please do. But that last note you struck there, Brian, is perhaps an honest acknowledgement that any of us should have about the role of luck in our lives. But insofar as we want to point to meritocratic talent-based systems, luck is not supposed to play an especially large feature. If it were luck, I've occasionally proposed this with some cheekiness to the Stanford admissions office. Let's imagine a system of admission where luck plays a role. Get down to the final 5,000 or 10,000 applicants, and then choose 2,000 people to admit by lottery. That would acknowledge the role of luck, but that's not the story that Stanford tells the world. On the day one that people show up here in the first year class, you deserve to have been admitted to Stanford, is the message they receive, because of your hard work and your talent, not because luck played a role. Luck is not consistent with a meritocracy.
I would agree with you. I would also add timing, right? Luck and timing are two fundamental components, if you will, of the success criteria. And they're completely outside your control, right? I wasn't born in 1955. I wasn't there for the emergence of the PC. Yep. But I was born in 1972, for the emergence of the internet. So I was there at the right time, in the right place to capitalize and be a participant in the growth of the internet.
Mm-hmm.
I would add, my experience with organizations is that, say, a business or even a university, is that people tend to, probably consciously, be attracted to want to work with or study with people that they share values and culture with. It's very natural unless you're working really hard to fight. And so that it is very common for an organizational unit, when they're looking to add to that unit, to be biased to people that are similar to who they are. That's the way it works. And that and so that if you have a environment that's not particularly diverse, it tends, based on what I've observed, to stay that way. And so I think the difficulty is to, if you recognize that something is not very diverse, and you want to, and maybe not a real meritocracy, transitioning to something better is extremely difficult.
So I want to pull the thread on this a little bit, and ask the question in the following way. Hillary opened with these statistics about the lack of sort of representation of a diverse set of ethnic and racial groups in the hierarchy of the private sector in Silicon Valley among the engineers. We could also think about other sources of diversity that are lacking: ideological diversity, as we saw from the critiques of Google by James Damore in his memo.
So the question is, given that Silicon Valley has been wildly successful, is the lack of diversity actually a problem, and why? What is the case that you would make that somehow the homogeneity of Silicon Valley in terms of who designs products or who oversees companies or who allocates venture capital, like what's actually going wrong? Is there just some nirvana that is even a more productive economy, a more wildly creative private sector that we can't yet observe? Because,
I don't think that's the right question.
Okay.
I think that even if what you say is true, and that is, nothing better could have been done, it's just not fair, and that will cause unhappiness more broadly across society. And so the issue isn't can you necessarily. Some people argue that more diverse teams perform better. That is debatable. They may actually perform worse because people have trouble communicating with each other. But that may not actually be the question. The question is how do you make a cohesive society, and not how do you make the world's best company. And so there's a greater reason why you need to have fairness.
Okay, so that's an argument about potential consequences for society and stability. How about others on this question of to what extent is this actually a problem, and in what specific ways is it a problem? Laura.
I think part of it is what was in your question, which is we don't know what we don't know. Like, we don't know how much better it could be. Part of it goes to how you define success, which is to say, if you have generated a huge amount of capital, basically, is that successful when it exacerbates inequality? Like, does a rising tide really lift all boats, or are you just kind of like pulling things farther and farther apart? And so for the people who have the privilege to be able to kind of live in this part of the world and sit in this room, it feels like things are getting better, but really there are people who are just, either they're not moving or they're getting like pushed farther and farther back, and we are building an industry kind of on the backs of that. And I think that is part of what is happening. Like, if you're building self-driving cars that are going to run over black and brown people because they can't see them, like, you are literally expending black and brown lives for like white privilege. That's crazy. That's not success.
Hard to argue.
That's a hard. I'm definitely not going to argue with that. I mean, look, I'm white male, right? So I'm also reinforcing element to this system. I would like to think and hope that we can, over time, broaden the diversity of Silicon Valley. We've seen over the last 20 years a substantial amount of immigration that have brought in people from a variety of different parts of the world, especially Russia, China, India, which I think has helped improve the diversity of the workplace. In some areas. It doesn't necessarily help with certain ethnicities, and it doesn't always help with gender, but it is improving Silicon Valley to when I first came to Silicon Valley in 1991. Back then it was literally all bunch of white guys all at the same time, and now it's gotten better. So I guess I have a little more of an optimistic perspective on this, that over time it will improve. And then we see it also in the undergraduate statistics of how many women are participating in computer science. When I graduated in '94, there were 10 women in my graduating class in computer science. And now, of course, the numbers have skewed a lot more broadly.
CS is the largest major amongst women at Stanford.
Yeah.
So I want to invite you, Brian, to expand a little bit on this theme. Earlier today, you described yourself as an extreme outlier in one sense, which was a voice in Facebook for privacy, right? You were the one person in the company. No, I'm just kidding. There may have been more. But you were making the case in high-level meetings that privacy needed to be protected. And the question is, where did that value come from for you? How did you identify that as a critical priority that should animate your founding of WhatsApp? What was it in your own experience or the interactions that you had with others? And then how did you manage to maintain that in an environment where capital infusions for your company are based on monetization and growing your user base and all of these things that lead people to adopt what we might call a values framework that is associated with Silicon Valley?
Well, first I would say that I don't want to discredit Jan and his contributions. My co-founder Jan grew up in Soviet USSR, in which privacy was probably even more of an important element in his life. And there's a very good blog post that he wrote some years ago about a conversation not suitable for the telephone because people were worried about the KGB or whoever listening in. In terms of my own origin story, maybe it's my own sort of technical proclivities, but I never felt that it was appropriate for technology to interfere in communications, interfere in human behavior. And as we started growing WhatsApp and building WhatsApp, that belief got stronger and stronger. WhatsApp started as a non-encrypted product, and we added encryption later. We collaborated with Moxie, Marlinspike at Signal, and that was what brought end-to-end encryption into WhatsApp. And so it was a journey for us. And I will say, going back to even the luck element to this, we found a business model that worked. And that helped us control our destiny and have a better relationship with our investors so that we could maintain more control. And that simple business model of $1 per year paid the bills. And that's what it needed to do. We didn't have to go out and aggressively seek funding and then give up control. We were able to maintain a substantial amount of control and continue working against our own personal values and maintain those values.
If I can follow up on that, so there's something beautiful about this story where you had a sincere commitment to a set of values, right? You had a sincere commitment to privacy in this case, and you were able to find a business model that was consistent with that commitment. But as the story unfolded, clearly it wasn't just this beautiful tale where we've always lived in the utopian world where the business model and privacy coexisted, right? At one point, you decided, you and Jan and perhaps the whole team, to sell to a company that maybe has now shifted to commit to privacy in a bigger way, but certainly hasn't historically been a champion of privacy. How does something like that happen? What are the pressures in the ecosystem that allow even the most ardent privacy advocate to end up selling to a company like Facebook?
Yeah, and I've said it before, and I think a lot of it is a certain naive attitude when you go into it. That when in an acquisition scenario, it happens very fast. First of all, it happened in a whirlwind Valentine weekend, of all things, in 2014. You don't necessarily lay out. You don't lay out every last detail beforehand. I went into it more with the expectation that I thought WhatsApp could represent a diversified business model to Facebook. And it was only after subsequent years that sort of Mark said to me, well, I think more of like WhatsApp is part of a family of products that all share a common backbone of a user and data and infrastructure. And so that unfolded over time. That's not hard. That's harder to negotiate up front. That said, we did try to put some stipulations in our contracts at the time of the acquisition. I don't say that they were necessarily strong stipulations or very enforceable stipulations, but we tried. We wanted to make sure that we could continue to steward WhatsApp successfully. And I think for the first 2-3 years we did that. But eventually, sort of mounting pressures of generating revenue against a 10-year revenue projection, driven by the CFO, for example, were much bigger pressures than I was wanting to take on, right? And it was time.
On the privacy front, I have just an observation to make. I understand that we should have privacy in our communications. That makes sense, but in a way, the question is privacy from whom? Does that also include the government? And this is where the end-to-end encryption debate comes in place. I sometimes think these days have been professionally working in regulated financial markets, and your personal financial information, obviously you'd like everyone, you're entitled to privacy. Everyone feels that they should, right, your financial information is equally important to keep private from your communications with your friends. But it turns out that there isn't that much privacy with your personal finances. For years, Switzerland and some other havens, would guarantee you privacy, but eventually everyone got fed up with that because it was heavily abused. There are all kinds of know your customer rules to prevent money laundering and all sorts of other things. And in fact, really, in the end, I think everyone converged on a viewpoint globally that having privacy when it comes to finance is has a big downside, and there has been now years and years and years of effort to get rid of the privacy.
So I want to get back to the point around privacy, because I think then we can also talk about national security beyond finance. Before we move into that realm, though, I wanted to follow up on one point that was related to something you all said. So, David, you mentioned something about building a cohesive society as opposed to building a company. And Laura, you talked about the fact that Silicon Valley is not a meritocracy. And Brian, you were talking about you found a business model that works. And all of these speak to kind of a different aspect of the notion that many companies are driven by profit motives, and that they should, in some sense, do what they believe is the right thing to do to maximize profit if you believe that's what companies should do. So what I'm wondering is, from your different perspectives, if you think about that mantra that there's a lot of people building companies because essentially they want to generate more revenue to then generate more capital and essentially, have something of high value that they sell or goes to a public market. How do you resolve that with the notion of thinking about, well, I'm building a company, but I need to worry about societal cohesion, or I need to worry about how I think about diversity playing into that mix, or I change my business model to think about, more revenue in the future? How do you think about the value versus this kind of overarching notion of profit maximization?
I'd start and say that you apply good fiscal discipline. And what do I mean by that? I mean that you layer your values into your profit motive and you make sure that they're consistent and stay consistent. The important part is staying consistent and not letting those values run away or letting external factors force you away. I worked at Yahoo many years ago, and Yahoo faced huge pressures to deliver to Wall Street, to the point where they started, sacrificing the user experience and sacrificing other things. And it becomes easier to start to play with people's privacy because you need to just meet the numbers, right? But if you have good fiscal discipline and you relate that to Wall Street or you relay that to your investors, they get it, they understand it, and you stick with it. And it works well for us. It worked well for us. We weren't especially, I don't want to say the word, but we weren't especially seeking, revenue maximization, right? We were just seeking revenue, good revenue that could cover our costs, which I think represented a more disciplined approach to how we ran our business.
I guess I would add on to that. I think that is all right. And given the fact that both legally companies are set up to maximize profit, and that the culture of the Valley is very much one of, building this kind of billionaire unicorn, there is a cultural incentive to make profit. All of that would seem to indicate we would like companies to do a good job of self-regulating, but they can't be the only actors regulating themselves. There need to be institutions that have values like democracy built into their kind of DNA, doing some of the regulation as well, at the very least, when missteps are made.
Yeah, I completely agree. But I might make the point even more forcefully in that, I believe that, companies should all strive to be good contributors to society broadly, and that clearly it's not only important to maximize profits. However, I think that society should assume that all companies are doing is trying to maximize profits at all costs, and hence develop other checks and balances to keep things in order. So, hope for the best and plan for the worst.
Yeah, so let me pick up on that point, because so we've been talking about values, and chiefly until the remark you just made there, David, refereed from the standpoint of an employee in a tech company or a founder or an investor in a tech company. And so I want to put on the table now a question about external regulation and the role of public policy, perhaps citizen or user pressure as well. Maybe that's got to be part of the conversation about striking the right balance in terms of values. So I'll try out a hypothesis and see if I can get you to react to it all. So the hypothesis is something like this, that in the world of finance, and David in particular, you're an engineer and bring an algorithmic model to the world of finance, but out here in Silicon Valley, it's not the financial industry as the chief sort of place to place a bet. The idea in my head is that Silicon Valley is what I'll describe as an immature industry in two respects. It's immature both in the length it's existed as a recognizable industry, let's call it 30 or 40 years old here in Silicon Valley, and it's immature in a second respect in that the founders tend to be young people with not a ton of experience either as having done a lot of other things in the world. So they're in their 20s and 30s. Whereas by contrast, the finance industry has gone through all types of turmoil globally and domestically over the course of decades and has matured in a way in which it accepts a certain amount of regulation, not as something to grit your teeth and resist at all costs, but as a natural part of the environment in which a for-profit industry in finance has to exist. So we're looking at a growth cycle or developmental stage of Silicon Valley in which it's currently in the kind of temper tantrum twos or unruly teenager stage of development. It'll eventually mature, let's hope, and become a bit more like other ordinary industries which accept regulation as a kind of ordinary feature of the environment. What do you think?
I hate it. Having lived in the Valley and worked in the Valley for 25 years, more than 25 years, I think regulation is seen as an impediment to innovation. Mm-hmm. That take the taxi cab union or taxi cab regulations, and all of a sudden it's hard for Uber to do what they're doing, and everyone loves Uber, and Uber's an innovation, right? Or Lyft, sorry. And then I could say the same thing about finance. I mean, one of my last projects at WhatsApp was to try to do money transfer between two users in India. And India banking regulations basically stymied the launch of that product for over 2 years. So, I think a lot of those of us that have been entrepreneurial view regulation as an impediment. Mm-hmm. And in fact, Jan and I tried to avoid regulated industry and we were always worried about telco regulations rearing their ugly head with us. Thankfully, no one ever came after us for telco reasons, mm-hmm. but we just felt it would be an impediment to innovation.
Mm-hmm. Laura or David?
I think I agree that is the kind of prevailing viewpoint. I think something that might start to change hearts and minds about that is it seems like all of these big tech companies are now running into problems that they have no desire to be solving. Like nobody at Facebook sat down and said, I want to write the rules about what hate speech is. Like nobody signed up for that job, and now they're having to do it. And probably, maybe there are some people who are enjoying that exercise, but for the most part, engineers at Facebook did not sign up for that job. They don't want that job. And if someone is going to come in and do that job for them, both because they don't want to do it and because then they can abdicate the blame when things go wrong, maybe that's going to start to change minds about it.
I think this is, a classic problem of not having to pay for your externalities. This is well studied in economics. I would love to operate an oil refinery without any environmental regulations. I will become an instant gazillionaire overnight. I don't want to overstate this, but to some extent, Silicon Valley has found an easy way to make money because they really, in general, don't have to cover the cost of their collateral damage. Other more mature industries do. And so indeed, the regulation in finance is, at times, not at times, is expensive for firms to comply with, and it substantially reduces profitability, but it has stabilized the global financial markets most of the time. Now, as people, financiers 100 years ago knew, many of these became gazillionaires because they had very few rules to comply with. I mean, it's obvious in the financial markets, if you don't have to worry about stuff like insider trading and market manipulation, you'll get rich really fast.
So let me ask a follow-up, taking the terrible twos or the unruly teenager, example a little bit further. So you're the veteran, you're wise, you're maybe the father who's sort of experienced the maturation, and you sit in the heavily regulated financial industry, which is a product not always of the willingness of the financial industry to be regulated, this forward-looking about the returns to regulation, but sometimes it's thrust on the financial industry as a consequence of crisis, Dodd-Frank, for example. So if you say this is a classic case of externalities that are not paid for, looking at the kid in his or her terrible twos, what are those externalities that need to be accounted for? As you look at the kind of systemic challenges that are created by the tech industry, what would you put your finger on and say, these are the externalities that are most damaging, that have to be addressed by regulation?
Well, unfortunately, it's not a simple problem. The rules and regulations to make the financial markets work correctly have taken, over 100 years to develop, and gazillions of people have been working on them. There are government agencies all around the world. I mean, this is a massive undertaking, and still, even with all the effort to try to, make the markets work correctly, they malfunction, on an occasional basis. So I wish I could give you a very simple answer there, but an example of an externality is that so somehow the tech platforms have crippled news-gathering organizations because it's transferred, who's making the money around, and so now, news organizations have, small, far smaller budgets than they had 20 years ago. So the quality of news, everyone agrees, is going down, and okay, that's a problem. But the tech platform companies that caused it, have absolutely no responsibility economically to do anything about it.
So Brian, should they have a responsibility to address that externality?
The glib answer would be absolutely, but I think it's a much more complicated, problem that it's difficult to even assess, like how much damage is being done and how much value is being destroyed and or created. I mean, if anything, is this just a transference of value, or is this something else? I don't know. I think that I think the other thing is that technology changes so fast, and it's difficult for industries and people even and regulators to keep up with it, right? I mean, Facebook, let's recognize, is 15 years old total, right? It's only been in existence 15 years, and now people are pointing their fingers at it saying they're doing this wrong and this wrong and this wrong, right? Facebook will be supplanted, or something else will come along in the next 5 years, and it will be the next generation and the next generation. That's the nature of technology. It just changes so fast. It's difficult to keep up from a regulating point of view, and it's difficult to even hold companies or industries accountable because things are changing.
Well, let me make try this out. So we should get rid of the FDA because the process of approving drugs is cumbersome, slow, and very expensive. And it really does stifle innovation in medicine. And so wouldn't it be better if companies could just create something and then offer it to people and just give rep that it's actually probably a good pill for you to take to, I don't know, grow hair on your head, and then, okay, there is absolutely no question that if you got rid of the FDA, there would be a lot more innovation in medicine and cures and treatments. There really would be. I mean, it's not, the only downside is there'll be a lot of dead people. And, so I'm not sure. There's.
That's a fine and illustrative example, but I'm going to stick with the journalism for a second. When I first came to campus 15, 20 years ago, I recall going to a presentation by a guy named Craig Newmark, and of course the guy who created Craigslist. So far as I can make out, a really nice guy, and he was introduced to everyone to applause as, this is Craig Newmark, the founder and creator of Craigslist, the guy who killed local newspapers. And people applauded him. If you accept that David's proposition that journalism is an unfortunate byproduct, the destruction of a revenue model for journalism is an unfortunate byproduct, let's say in particular of Craigslist, but of a tech approach. So, the title of our class is The Ethics of Technological Disruption. The glib answer you said was, sure, they could account for the externalities. I guess I want to put on the table the idea, it shouldn't be a badge of honor to say, I created this great website and it killed off local newspapers. We might want to worry and anguish a bit about that. And then I at least want to hear something about what the responsibility is, if not for the tech company to do, for external regulation, society to do. It doesn't have to be a federal law that's passed. Maybe there's a self-regulation within the industry. Is it, philanthropy should step in and Herb Sandler should do more of ProPublica? Simply saying, what a nifty disruption. Away with the newspapers and we'll put it all on ads on Craigslist.
Oh, okay. Again, the technology is changing, right? You shouldn't blame, Facebook for the death of newspapers. Blame the internet for that. The internet was fundamentally what the foundation for the dissemination of information. So a news story could get propagated and, distributed to the entire world without selling a newspaper. That's when I canceled my newspaper subscription. That was the beginning of the downfall for journalism. Sure. Not citizen journalism with Craig, not Mark with Facebook. It was the internet itself, right? So let's go back in time to 1994 when the internet was taking off and ask ourselves, what could we have done or what should we have done to protect an industry that maybe shouldn't exist in the way it is? And then also ask ourselves, what's the end state, right? What is the end state? I don't think anyone has that answer as to what journalism should turn into, right? We have journalists that still survive at very established organizations like the New York Times, the Washington Post, but I don't think anyone knows what the final end state should be for how journalism should manifest in this modern world of this internet, where anyone can publish at any time via a blog, via Twitter, via Instagram, or any other social media outlet. Right? We don't have the answer. But let's not point the finger at Facebook and say, oh, Facebook has to pay the piper for the death of journalism. It's not Facebook's fault, it's the internet's fault.
Or it's a bunch of different, the internet is a bunch of essentially activities on the internet. The internet, the internet's not doing anything. It's the applications on the internet. So it's clearly not all Facebook's fault. But I think we have to be careful here because, we don't want to go the direction of the climate change debate, where essentially people it's like who's responsible for climate change? We can debate the science and we can say, well, and then eventually the answer is, well, I guess no one's really responsible for it, so we won't do anything about it. And it's not a blame game as much as a solution game. And so I don't blame. In my mind, Facebook or Google or any of these companies for anything per se. They weren't deliberately trying to do it, but it just so happens that the advertising, that ad revenue, everyone, this has been studied just like climate change. The ad revenue has shifted from newspapers to the platform companies. That happened. Okay, there's no debate about that. And so, And there's no debate that that shift in ad revenue has reduced the revenue to the news gathering organizations. I mean, this really did happen, just like the glaciers are really melting.
I was going to argue against blame. I'll come to you in a second, Marilyn, but then you brought up climate change. And I just think, we could spend a lot of time going down the blame game. In the climate context, it's really important because it's an international debate about who has responsibility for taking action and what the distribution of that responsibility should be, right? And that debate between those who have been most affected by the consequences versus those who have really contributed to those consequences given historical growth patterns is really a salient element when it comes to bearing the costs associated with transforming economies. But if we set aside the blame, I mean, the thing that I'm struggling with, Brian, in your response, it's not about whether Facebook or the internet or some combination of a whole set of factors caused the decline of local journalism and the accountability mechanism that it represents for our democracy. It's the fact that that decline is real, as David just said, and do we care? And if we care that that has disappeared or is weakening, what are we going to do about it, and who is we? Is we our democratic society? Is we government taxing those who are doing well to redistribute resources to make sure that we can fund journalism as a public institution rather than a private sector institution, given that the business models have changed? The question is that an important value, not who caused it, and as a result, what do we do about it?
I think we should seek to find the truth in information, right? I think fundamentally that's what people want and that's what people need. It's truthful, correct, honest as possible information, and that they have means and mechanisms to get that information, and that they can trust those mechanisms are actually valid. And unfortunately, right now, in this day, in the digital age, it's getting distorted pretty heavily. It's being distorted externally from forces outside the United States. It's getting distorted by people inside the United States. It's just getting distorted. I don't think Facebook or anyone, Google, anyone has a solution for this problem. It's too easy to distort the truth. It's too easy to distort the information and be a participant in that, that ecosystem. What is the regulation? I don't know. What is the new model? I don't know, right? And that's where I'm saying that the technology is changing so fast and we as human beings can't keep up with it. And it actually may become a runaway situation where it gets even worse, where it's like we look at any piece of information, we're like, oh, is that fake news or not? That would suck.
No, I completely agree with what you said, but I want to go back to the point I was making, and which you just made, that the problems are hard. And again, as I said, to create rules for global finance and markets, it's an extraordinarily hard problem to get the rules and to make it work right, which is why an extraordinary amount of money is spent globally trying to figure out what these rules should be. If you think of all of the lawyers involved, all of the regulators involved, all of the academics that are involved, all the business leaders that are involved. I mean, no one's added the number up, but it's an extraordinary undertaking to figure out how to prevent to allow money to move around the world in a manner that is not fraudulent. The list goes on and on. I think that this is pretty obvious. So what I would say is that we're just under-investing in trying to, like, if we expect that, and again, I'm not being critical of Facebook, but if they assemble a small team of people, or even 50 people, or 100 people, or 1,000 people, trying to figure out how to solve some of the problems that you're talking about, I mean, that's like a drop in the bucket. That's like a teeny little effort, and doing it entirely internally without a broader collaboration from, let's just say, society and perhaps other companies and so forth, it seems like it's an ineffective way to go about solving or trying to improve. They're not going to solve the problem, by the way. It's only about making improvements. I don't think that's a good framework for making improvements.
Well, so to think about some of these externalities and then maybe bring Alora back into the conversation is kind of this view of short-term versus long-term thinking in terms of how this evolves. So, to speak specifically about news, one could say that, Google, for example, has launched this initiative to support journalism because in some sense, Google News can't exist if all the journalists go away, right? There's nothing left to aggregate. So there's some notion of a long-term view of we've caused a problem, but we need to do something to try to address the cause because in the long term, if we don't, we've actually hampered the business. And so I guess to bring that back to the point of diversity too, there's kind of the business side of it for how you think about long term. And the diversity view, one of the views we sometimes get from the companies is, well, there's a pipeline problem. There aren't enough people graduating with diverse backgrounds, and we need to wait until those numbers increase, and that means we need to wait until there's more faculty with diverse backgrounds. That means we have to wait for more people to go to graduate school with diverse backgrounds, and it's this 100-year pipeline before we solve the problem, but it's still a long-term view to take toward it. And so I think in terms of balancing that short-term and long-term, what is your feeling? Do you think that really these are problems that in the long-term just work out, or there's steps that can be taken now in the short-term to try to mitigate them, both from the information standpoint and from the diversity standpoint? You want to start with diversity to bring that in?
Sure. So I guess I would say maybe it all will work out in the long term, but what are the costs? Like, what are we kind of losing? And as to maybe the diversity question, it's like, are we kind of exacerbating equality, racial, socioeconomic, gender inequality in the short term in a way that's going to be hard to recover from? As to the journalism question, I think, we were talking a little bit about, who's to blame here, and I think one of the things that is difficult about that conversation is there's the problem of news is dying, and then there's this meta problem, which is that there are 3 companies with the power to do anything about that. And I think that is an example of, if you kind of let things get this unequal in the short term, they become harder and harder and harder to solve in the longer term because you put yourself in a position where the institution that is supposed to be democratically accountable, i.e. our government, has less power over making these things work than it once did, and therefore we as citizens and voters have less power to solve these problems than we did before we gave that power to 3 actors, and they might not be the same 3 actors a decade from now. It might not be Google and Facebook and Amazon, but it'll be someone else, and it still won't be us, and it still won't be our government.
So part of what we're talking about here is the obligations that an individual company has for rectifying some of the harms that it's caused in various ways. I mean, one of the things that's been mentioned a couple different times, and that's an adding confounding factor here, is that these harms are not contained to a single nation or a single community. They are distributed across the globe. And while I, in some ways comforted by a story where Google, realizing it's broken news, then wants to invest in and solve news, I'm also very wary about a world where, Facebook realizes it's causing mental health issues, and so now it's a mental health advocate, and Facebook worries that it's broken democracy, and now it's a civic agent. It's I don't want them to be able to swallow every solution space that possibly exists. So I'm wondering, just to make this super practical, Brian, as a person who was at the helm of one of these companies, that product was used in various ways, probably not solely to blame, but was used in things as troubling as hate crimes or ethnic violence. How do you think about the responsibilities that WhatsApp has for that being done, and how do you, conceive of what you owe or don't owe on that front?
Owe or don't owe. It's very easy to try to play this role in technology of the technology will provide all these guardrails. But at the end of the day, I think what ends up happening is that there's a certain level of suppression that happens. And so I think what ended up happening, at least with me and WhatsApp, was we got to a place where we were like, you know what? We can't predict all the ways that people are going to use this technology. We're just going to let people use it. And if they use it for good, great. If they use it for bad, that's a shame, but we can't control it. In some ways, you could say that's an apologist washing of hands, so to speak. But I think it was also a very pragmatic choice that you really just can't police human behavior without other human beings doing the policing, right? And so trying to apply some fancy algorithm or some fancy AI to try to detect online bullying or a potential teen suicide or any of that stuff, it's impossible, right? And so I think Jan and I just took the perspective of, you know what, guys, it's not possible in today's world. Let's not try. And instead, let's protect people in other ways. And that was what we came to terms with.
Go ahead.
So I wanted to ask a question about sort of the relationship between sort of progress in technology and technology leadership and the policy process. So part of the message, on the stage, in particular from Brian, has been sort of technology is changing so fast. It's going to be very difficult for regulators to keep up with it. Hard to interfere in human behavior and know whether you're doing the right thing or a good thing. The perspective from David, is it took 100 years, trillions of dollars of investment, a lot of time to build in the guardrails that we need, to maintain the financial system. Alora, you made the choice to transition from being a computer scientist, working as an engineer, and for whatever reason and with whatever status effects for you, you abandoned CS as this mecca and went to law school. And so you've obviously made some choices yourself about where to invest your time. And I think one of the themes that we've been grappling with is just how broken the conversation is between those who sit in the technology space and those who sit in the policy space. That people in technology have a disinterest and even strong incentives not to see regulation, yet the risk of that posture not only is these externalities being magnified, but also forms of regulation that will be massively harmful to the kind of progress that we care about. So it may be that technology moves so fast that regulation can't keep up, but that doesn't mean that politicians aren't going to come under enormous pressure to regulate. Right? And that's the moment that we're in right now where that pressure is taking off. And so the question is, how do we get that conversation back on the right track so that what gets regulated reflects not only our best sense of what sorts of values we want to protect in our society or what sorts of externalities that we want to address, but also a reckoning with what we need to preserve in order for the innovation that's a part of Silicon Valley to thrive. Because I think the disinterest and the rejection or the sense that this is an impediment is quickly being overtaken by a political backlash to the inequality that's been generated as a function of Silicon Valley, to the demographic misrepresentation in terms of who's designed for and who's doing the designing. And all it took was for 9/11 to create a Patriot Act, almost overnight without a ton of forethought, that rolled back all sorts of civil liberties and protections that we would have thought were non-negotiable. And I think Silicon Valley has to be prepared that there's something, maybe not this moment, that will create exactly that kind of response. And we've got to get ahead of it if we're interested in balancing these different things on the table.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree with that. I would observe that this is a success story in the following sense that big tech, wasn't big tech until recently. Its success has made it an incredibly important systemic part of our society. And that's terrific. Everyone should be incredibly proud here, the epicenter of where it happened. But and again, this is the analogy of growing up, if you wish. I don't think that there is enough recognition that, in fact, this has become a systemic risk factor that all of society now feels is for them to have a say in and worry about. Now, it's one thing if you have a small tech company in a new space. You definitely don't want the government and regulation in your hair to prevent innovation. But maybe it's a little, look, I think actually the firms here are going to make, will regret what happens if they don't, acknowledge that they have become, systemically important, as critical as any other, big, systemic institutions in the country and the world, and rapidly move to try to convince the politicians and the country and the rest of the world that this that we are going to exhaust every angle we can to address the concerns that people keep complaining about.
I guess as you're speaking, one of the things that came to mind is that I guess I'm not kind of particularly optimistic that everyone in Silicon Valley is going to wake up tomorrow and decide that like inequality and bias and whatever externalities have been created are like problems worth addressing, and we're going to forego short-term profits and all that. We're going to fix it. I'm not particularly optimistic about that happening on a systemic level, but I do think like there is kind of an awakening outside of Silicon Valley. I mean that like outside the industry more than outside the geography, about how all this might happen, but people's ability to actually do anything about that as citizens is going to be stifled by the fact that like one of the externalities of this industry seems to be democracy, seems to be that like,
that's a big one.
Right. Seems to be like our kind of, in addition to many of the other challenges democracy is facing, it's like now facing these challenges where there were all these articles written, I think around 2016, and then previously before, like could Google rig an election? Could Facebook rig an election? Well, yeah, it could, like if it really wanted to. And so our ability to do anything about, so maybe that's kind of where the regulation needs to start, is like, look, we don't know what to do with you yet. We're moving so fast. We don't understand you. We don't speak your language. You don't speak ours. But at the very least, we need to kind of safeguard democracy and journalism and the couple other things that allow us to have levers against you.
You want to say?
Okay, so
great.
can I just say, can I follow up one thing with David just, because I feel like the finance industry is getting like softball treatment in this conversation a little bit.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
I was going to remark, by the way, that one of the great things about this is that we used to be in the most despised industry, and the attention has been taken off of us.
No, so exactly. We had this conversation 3 weeks ago when we had the deputy director of the NSA on the stage with the chief privacy officer for Facebook, and everyone was like, including the Electronic Frontier Foundation, we love the NSA, right? So, Snowden is a distant memory in comparison to what we're dealing with now. But so in putting the spotlight back on the finance industry, this is the point I wanted to make as a follow-on to my question, which is, okay, I exhorted you in some sense to think about the important roles that technologists need to play in shaping this conversation about governance, lest governance overtake technology in a way that's ultimately harmful. But we also know what kind of democracy we live in. So if technology companies were to follow the path of our friends at Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, that basically took over the government, right, and sort of created this revolving door between Wall Street leadership and the Treasury Department, facilitated deregulation, allowed for all sorts of consolidation that enhanced systemic risk, that'd be a great strategy actually for the tech companies. And so the question is, what is the check on that, right? If tech companies begin to wake up to the systemic risk, but also the fact that the check on their power that may come from government requires, as we've seen, massive investments in lobbying that challenge privacy bills and regulations against algorithms and all these kinds of things that are out there that are a reflection of the tech companies waking up politically. The question is, how does our under-equipped political system surface the competing values that would need to be represented rather than giving way to the experts. And I think that was always one of the challenges with the regulation of the financial industry. And we saw this with credit default swaps and the home mortgage crisis and the like, which is that these things were the province of experts that really couldn't be interrogated in a way that might protect against externalities.
True. Well, again, it's complicated. But one thing I would definitely, I think related to your point, is that in finance, some of the regulation is done by the government, SEC, but there are these, and the term has a confusing meaning. They're called self-regulatory organizations, like FINRA, for example, and self-regulation. Here everyone thinks it means a company is going to regulate itself, but actually what it means, it's just being misused here actually. What the term refers to is when a industry consortium regulates itself. It's not one company regulating itself, but it's a group of companies collectively regulating themselves, which is promotes a lot more accountability. So FINRA is a collection of financial firms which has been granted power by the SEC. It's an industry group, so FINRA is a private organization, a nonprofit, 501c3. It's been granted power by the government to enforce certain kinds of market integrity. And because this is an industry-led group and it's paid for by industry fees, the people working for FINRA are paid normal industry salaries, not government salaries, so it has high-quality people. And the people that understand the markets, they can not going to be outgunned by pay scales, and so this structure has actually worked pretty well, and I think the key thing here is a FINRA-like organization could potentially work in the tech industry. But it's not one company regulating itself. It's essentially all the companies getting together, working together to solve the problems. But the key thing is the government has to agree to it, because if not, it would be a cartel and it would be illegal. Mm-hmm. It requires some kind of collaboration between industry and government to make it happen.
Another example, perhaps, other than FINRA, is the Motion Picture Association and the ratings guides for movies, which is not a law passed by the federal government, but an industry association agreement to abide by. All right, I want to put one more question on the table, partly thinking in light that this is the last class, and perhaps unexpectedly, I want to come to Brian's defense here. I worry that at the end of these 6 classes, one of the things that might come across to someone who's been paying attention is that the kind of meta lesson is, look how unethical the tech industry is. Look at all of the collateral damage of the tech industry. Don't we want to do something about it? And I mean, Brian, I'm putting a few words in your mouth here. I want to take a different point of view. It's not that the lesson at the end of the day, at least for me, is that we need tech leaders and tech workers and the education of CS students at Stanford now to implant them with the right ethical framework, and then that will be the inoculation that solves the problem. I have in mind something along the lines of what Brian said, namely you attach yourself necessarily as a tech leader, in fact necessarily as a human being in certain respects, to a set of values. So Brian's gone all in on privacy, with a particular technical approach with end-to-end encryption. And if I heard you correctly, you basically said you could point to this as a principle that you think is really important, or you could be pragmatic in the sense of human behavior is just really difficult to regulate and to govern. And so practically speaking, give people the permission to do what they want with the means at their disposal. So, I mean, what resonates with me, at least, is it's not as if I want to then have any one of us decide, well, that's ethical and good, or that's unethical and bad, but rather, there's a value proposition there, and there's a stand now to be engaged with. Now, you might disagree with it. You might say, well, national security also counts for something. Democracy, if in fact WhatsApp is being used to do really bad things, and it's your product, you have to have something to say in response, but at least there's a value proposition. We know what you stand for. So, I mean, I want to open the floor then to a conversation about the, and at the end of the day, I think discussing the tech industry or any leader as being ethical or unethical seems to me an ill-posed question. Rather, what are the values, especially as you've assumed all this power, 1 billion people on WhatsApp? I mean, it's not just the local hardware store that's making value trade-offs with the people who are there. It's 1 billion people using the service. That's a huge amount of power. You're leading with this really bright, value about privacy. And I guess I invite anyone to see, is that a framework that makes sense? We all have to have a values-based discussion. Here's privacy embodied in a platform with 1 billion people, or Signal, as the case may be now. And the question is then a conversation about how we have to strike trade-offs with other things, like national security, like the effects on democracy, et cetera, et cetera.
I think conjoined with values is also rights and privileges. Earlier today I mentioned the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Nothing exists like that for the digital rights, right? Insofar as if you're a digital citizen and you're a part of this digital community, what are your rights and privileges as a participant, right? And you could get really far into this, and you could even come up with a new Bill of Rights for digital citizenry and start to strive down that path. I mean, I think privacy is an element there. Autonomy, personal direction, I think is another. And I think you could come up with a nice list of these are the rights of all citizens as part of the digital age. The funny part is the internet is 30 years old, right? The birthday was yesterday. But even being 30 years old, to me, it still feels like we're still at the beginning, right? Because there are so many problems and so many things that we still have to figure out. And some will have to ensconce in principle, and some will have to ensconce in statutes, and some will have to ensconce through learning and doing, right, and experience. And it's a wild ride. I mean, I'm grateful to be alive at this day and age to see the birth of the internet. And my children will never understand, what I went through 30 years ago at the birth of the internet compared to what they get now. The world has just changed so quickly. But yes, I do stand on principle, and I do stand for a specific set of rights. And I think that we could have that dialogue, and we could, as a group of people and a global population, come to a consensus on these are important, and we should stick to them.
Laura, you want to add something here?
Yeah, I guess what I was going to add is I do think it's important to kind of exist in a values-based model, like the trade-off between privacy and national security. I'm not sure there's a right answer there, but I think it's important to have people on kind of both sides of that debate. I guess what worries me about Silicon Valley in particular is like, who are you inviting to that conversation? And if it's like the 7 of us having that conversation, we are going to naturally represent a set of viewpoints, and there's a whole set of viewpoints that are going to be unrepresented. And I think the takeaway is not Silicon Valley is evil. I think the takeaway is like Silicon Valley has all these blind spots that it doesn't even know about, and it should have a values-based, we should all have a values-based conversation, but we should also not know what values aren't being represented, and we should bring those to the table, or that's, where government steps in to force us to bring those values to the table.
I agree with both of your observations. I would, only add, but there's also the practical, yes, there should be, it should be values-based, but you also have to be practical as well. And so, if somehow the values are clashing with, the practical problems, you might have to reflect on, well, maybe the values aren't adjusted or calibrated correctly.
The practical problem of a philosopher is to engage with the values all the time.
Right.
I want to invite people to stand up. We're going to shift to audience questions right now, but just for fun, and it's not really pushing back against Rob, but just to say, sort of recognizing these value trade-offs is important. But I hope part of what you take away is thinking hard about where those value trade-offs should be made. And when we throw around words like government and regulator, and there are kind of negative connotations associated with these words, as impediments to innovation, as impediments to progress, I think it is far too easy to forget that what government is the way that we as a society have decided to organize ourselves. And it is the best vehicle that we have, especially in a democratic society, for refereeing value trade-offs and making choices about what kind of society we want to live in. And so it's very easy to paint government as lacking sufficient capacity or knowledge or getting in the way, but it is the vehicle that we have, and it is the vehicle that we have that is accountable to us as citizens in a way that none of these other institutions are. And so I hope that, it's not that tech is unethical and government is ethical, because as we discussed the privacy national security trade-off, there are ways in which government has overstepped and abused in all sorts of extraordinary ways. It's just we know what it means to hold government accountable, because we have set up government to serve our interests. So why don't we start with a question over there?
Sure, mine's pretty short. In terms of a value-based conversation and the issue of short-term profit objective, I'm wondering if what could be possible in terms of how we operate the stock market, what we might need to change, what might be possible, because that seems to be what's driving the short-term profit agenda, and that seems to be something nobody really talks about changing.
In case people couldn't hear, it's a question about the short-term horizons of the stock market and what the effect is on decision-making within companies in virtue of the short-time horizon demand to return investment to shareholders. I mean,
I certainly experienced it the most when I worked at Yahoo, that it seemed like almost all the corporate decision-making was on a 90-day cycle for the next corporate earnings. And it was quite an unfortunate environment to be in, where you didn't feel like people were thinking about long-term shareholder value. I think in both Google and Facebook's case, I think they've been much more disciplined. It goes back to, again, fiscal discipline in these companies operating with good discipline and keeping in mind long-term shareholder value. The volatility of the stock market's an interesting beast. It's a it's a participation-based game, and we always have the option of not participating and participating in bonds or other financial instruments. It's just the American public seems especially enamored with it. I don't know if you have an opinion living in the financial sector, but.
Well, I mean, there's clearly an obsession on short-term results, but I'm not exactly sure where it comes from. In that, obviously, a lot of investing is done on a longer time horizon, and the majority of money invested in companies is not there for very short periods of time. And so the reality of it is that I think that if company management just had a thicker thicker spine, whatever is thicker, that skin, thank you. I'm still on New York time. That they would probably be served just well in the market. So I actually think part of the problem is just the management of companies become too obsessed with it, and it's not really the fault of the markets.
Yeah, over here.
Hi, this is Raj. Let me start with a small incident, a quote based on the meritocracy discussion which we had earlier. So 2 days back, I was telling my son, hey, do whatever is needed to get your grades up. Then I suddenly saw this article about New York Magazine talking about this issue. Then I told myself, what did I do? I should go back. I went and talked to my son. Hey, what I meant is, do you need help in tutoring, or do you need help in, so the value has to be enforced by each and every one. So that's the first comment, and let me go back to the value question. I had value question in user privacy and hiring. Let me start with user privacy. Do you protect at all situations, or do you protect there is no crime, and when there is a crime, you don't protect the user's privacy? Third one is protect all situations except certain crimes. Fourth is victim is not coming forward. And now do you let the, like for example, an incident happened in India where the victim is not coming forward because of the scare of public shaming in the WhatsApp, Facebook, everywhere. So that's the privacy, and second one is the hiring.
Okay, no, I'm going to stop you there just because we've got lines and I want to make sure others get in. So the question is about user privacy, and are there any limits on user privacy? It may be a core value for you, but where do you limit that?
Well, speaking from personal experience in the early days of WhatsApp, the decision making that we applied was basically, was it a capital crime? And so in those instances, we would work with law enforcement because we knew that there was loss of life involved. We avoided participating in non-criminal disputes, because there was, husband-wife type stuff that people would write to us about. And again, it just gets into this position of like, we don't want to be a part of this, right? You're trying to bring us into your dispute, a man and a woman's dispute over whatever, and we just didn't want to be a part of it. And we felt that actually adding end-to-end encryption actually protected WhatsApp as much as it protected the users, because WhatsApp couldn't be the arbiter of truth, and WhatsApp couldn't be the judge, jury, and executioner. It was just the original people that did the communication that were accountable. I prefer it that way. Otherwise you create this messy system where you have to figure out who's bullying who and who started it. And as a parent and as a father, sometimes it's not always clear which little boy starts the dispute.
Can I just add something to that, which is I think that is not necessarily a value-neutral decision, which is not to say that that is a bad thing or a good thing, but it's to say that like crime is a social construct. What the government says is crime is what we have collectively, or what our legislature has said is an antisocial behavior. And I think it's, on the one hand, you look at something like a homicide or terrorism where lives are lost, and you're like, that's very, very bad. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have something like marijuana, which there are widely differing views about whether that should be a crime or not. So for a tech company to say we are going to comply with law enforcement, like to the full extent of the law, is to endorse that kind of social construct, and to say we are only going to deal with capital crimes is to kind of enforce that social construct. And any decision you make along the middle is actually a deviation from whatever social construction democracy has kind of like purported to set up, which is not to say that we should, if there's something you strongly disagree with in the way the government has set up what is a crime, like that is maybe an internal values discussion.
Hi, I'm Anat Dmati, and I'm a professor here at the business school, and I'm sitting here because I've become concerned about the internet, and I'm teaching a course at this business school next quarter about sort of internet and society, entitled provocatively, "Is the Internet Broken?" Now, I have to speak today because the issue of finance came about, and I'm a finance professor, so I'm sorry to break it to Rob and to David that financial regulation is not working, and self-regulation is especially not working. So it's a little more, and on a day where it's very hard to keep track of both all the scandals in internet and the finance scandals. Maybe you've seen Tim Sloan in front of Congress yesterday being grilled. And so right here in our neighborhood is a bank that's particularly been reckless. And so it's about financialized corporate governance, and that's an issue that has become a huge problem in the whole issue of governing and who's in charge of this world, corporations or governments. I totally endorse what Jeremy just said, which is that we need to help our governments or we're really in bad problems. And so the problem with tech is it's not going to self-regulate. I'm not blaming anybody. I'm not blaming the banks either. We need better regulation of both of them, not the one we have. The fact that it's complicated doesn't make it effective. And we can talk about FINRA and how FINRA has worked and how self-regulation of auditors work and how the current regulator of the auditors is captured, and on and on. Bottom line is that we must decide what set of rules that we've created before for older technology and how they should apply to these, like Communication Acts or Decency Acts or all these others that I'm beginning to study. But this industry this desperately needs regulation. That's quite clear. And I think it is our collective action, not exactly as Jeremy said, to help governments and not to view it as markets are good and governments are bad or any of that. We have nothing but our governments to protect us. And so I hope you don't idealize financial regulation just because we know that we need it, or self-regulation because all we need is good regulation for these industries.
You know, I would just comment on that. Perfection is the enemy of the good. And so I think it's easy to criticize something, but the counterfactuals are not necessarily so obvious.
I wrote down kind of a long question, but I'm actually going to consolidate it into a tiny thing at the end here because a lot of it was answered during the conversation, which is great. At the very end of the conversation here, we were talking about a set of values or a value system that technology companies or society might represent as a guiding system for how technology companies should be ethical in the way that we understand it, backed by being practical, meaning the government should also regulate. Kind of curious about a slightly different way of looking at it, which is instead of trying to, or perhaps in addition to trying to, I guess, like reprimand companies by setting restrictions, are there any examples or bright spots of times when companies have sort of exposed these certain value systems that we think represent how more companies should act, and like what worked well there, and how might we have more of that happen? So sort of approaching the problem from like what's the little piece that's working well, and how do we do more of it, if anything.
So any bright spots about good corporate citizenship in some sense where these things are working and why? Don't everyone jump in at once.
Right, I'll start.
REI?
Right. I mean, again, I think the temptation in the question is then to go around and look at corporate behavior or CEO statements and say, very ethical, moderately ethical, not so ethical. And I have in mind an approach which says, how are you making trade-offs in your company? Let's be clear and transparent about it. So a couple weeks earlier, we had Courtney Bowman from Palantir in. And I won't get the quote exactly right, but it was something like, Palantir works with intelligence operations in other countries on behalf of Western civilization or liberal democracy, basically in the wake of 9/11 in order to try to identify and kill bad guys. That's a bright line value proposition about national security. I assume that if Palantir could fold into its big data operation all of the stuff that happens on WhatsApp, it would make them more effective. But they stand for something different than WhatsApp stands for. And for a lot of companies, simply saying we're profit maximizing isn't being transparent and then in some way accountable about the value trade-offs that the company is making, partly in virtue of the technical approach and the technology itself, or just the way the company happens to operate with regulators or otherwise. So I see Palantir as an example of the sort of company in this class in the past couple of weeks that is very clear about what its values is. You might disagree entirely, and therefore you can have a good argument with the people at Palantir. It's an open question how accountable they are to your view, and that's what makes democracy especially valuable, because a public official is accountable in some respect downstream. But it's not as if they're hiding behind a smokescreen of we're just a bunch of engineers twisting a bunch of knobs trying to make some money.
I mean, this is less a response to your question as much as it is a response to Rob's point here, but hopefully I'll tie it back to the question too. I mean, I too value the transparency of sharing what are your value trade-offs, but I also think we see every single company saying they stand for a certain set of values. How many people did we have up on this stage over the last 3 months that said our North Star is, connecting or moving or, inspiring, whatever it is, that, that it's one thing to say these things, and it's another thing, behind the guise of standing for liberal democratic values and catching bad guys and terrorists, Palantir has also done some things that, you'd actually say were probably done behind a smokescreen using that as a PR line, kind of. So I guess I I have a different answer to your question, which is about Apple and upholding privacy, but I would just say, we can celebrate companies for sharing their value statements explicitly, but I also think this is a place and this is a sector in which people are very quick to share values and strong commitments and slower to actually act in accordance with those values. And so we should be celebratory when there are strong value statements, but also a little bit skeptical, as I know you are, but a little bit skeptical where those value statements actually play out. The example I'd give you about somebody I'd hold up, though it's imperfect, and we've heard on this stage again how Apple has compromised itself when it's entered China and forgone its privacy commitments, but I will say, at least it is a company, and it does work with their business model, but it's a company that has said we stand for privacy and through made decisions that forgo certain revenue streams and certain business opportunities in the name of something that they hold dear.
This must be the microphone for professors, because I'm an emerita professor in both the School of Education and the Business School, and I'm a labor economist. And I have one comment and then a question. The comment is that my reading of history is that throughout American history, all of our industrialization has required regulation at some point. I don't see evidence of companies regulating themselves if we look historically. And if you look at workers in particular, workers got benefits through the government and through their trade unions, and very infrequently through companies by themselves. My question is this. Given the scope of the internet revolution, and like Brian, I lived through it also and found it to be utterly amazing, it can't be the case, I think, that the only regulation we need is from companies themselves or from government. We need all kinds of change in all of the institutions of society. And my question to you is, if you think about this for just a couple of minutes, where would you see those changes coming? I'm taken by Brian's example of harm being done to teenagers who harm themselves because of something that happens on the internet. That's not a problem just for internet companies. That's a problem for our whole society. It's a problem for educational institutions. It's a problem for mental health institutions. It's a problem for families. And so I would like to hear from people on the panel, if you thought about where we could intervene, not just through companies, not just through government writ large, but particular government institutions like educational institutions, what would you see as primary?
I'm a strong proponent of education. You already mentioned it, but I think, the internet is here to stay. And the more that we teach our children responsible behaviors on the internet, the more they're going to be effective citizens when they're 18, 20 years old. So it's got to start at an early age, and it has to be a continuous education. My children started out, they have iPads, they surf YouTube, and they watch too much YouTube. And, but they've already learned what's an ad, what's not an ad. We haven't even started to teach them to protect themselves, to control their personal information. There's so many guards that we should be teaching our children and educating. In addition to, what is fake news, right? How to give them the critical thinking skills to evaluate some piece of information and say, well, this kind of sounds fishy, right? So I'm all for a positive education experience starting at kindergarten and going all the way through the entire lifetime of the child's educational experience. Because fundamentally the internet's here, it's not going away, and it's just going to get worse.
Just one piece of social science evidence about the inclination to share fake news and the idea of using education system to bring up a generation of people capable of identifying what's fake and what's not. Evidence about fake news sharing on sites like Google, YouTube, Facebook indicate that it's in fact retired people who are the most likely to share fake information.
So maybe one hopeful thing to add to the comments around education. A couple years ago, actually about a year and a half ago, there was a framework for K through 12 education, a national framework that was developed around computer science education. And that's actually helped inform at this point more than a dozen states in terms of standards that they're adopting around education. The thing about that framework that's interesting is when most people hear about K through 12 standards or K through 12 framework for education, they think that's about programming and algorithms and what language you should teach. And about half of that framework is about social issues related to computing. Things like information validity, things like social inclusion, celebrating diversity. And so I think there are attempts to think at a very early stages in terms of what are the larger consequences of computing and try to work that into the education system. Now there's huge challenges in terms of how that actually gets rolled out and when it gets rolled out, but at least I'm hopeful with respect to thinking that the folks who are working on those educational pieces are actually thinking about the larger social issues.
So we have only a few minutes left. What I want to do is I want to collect 3 questions, not comments preferably, so questions that are short and brief. Then we'll go back to the panelists for some final comments on whichever of these issues you want to pull out, and then we'll say some closing words.
Well, I'm going to cut my question in half then. Brian, one of the things that you said was particularly striking, and I think for me, hit home at that discomfort I sometimes feel when we're having conversations about tech is the idea that the role of tech is not necessarily to change how human beings interact. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that, because I think that really does hit a nerve, I think for me as someone who works in tech. But when you are changing the ways that human beings interact, what today, not what necessarily are we going to change, how is education going to change things, but what today is the strongest check against changing how human beings interact, because it's not necessarily the tech companies. I don't necessarily think it's philanthropic organizations. The government is either in cahoots with Palantir or not necessarily trained to be, competent enough to ask the questions we need them to ask. So who today would you identify as that strong check?
The market. I think that fundamentally, and I've said this to reporters off and on, that unless a company sees a financial hit to their bottom line, that they're not going to change their behaviors. And so the market is, the stock market and subsequently, their financials are really the best checksum that we have, check and balance against these, what we think of as bad behaviors. So until there's some sort of market come to Jesus, if you will, I think these companies will continue to act in these ways.
Okay, let's take 2 final questions. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Kevin Barenblatt, started a Fast Forward, which is a tech accelerator for nonprofits. And I'm curious, I signed up for this class because I really wanted to learn about the ethics of technological disruption, and particularly hear from the leaders of our tech companies about how they're thinking about ethics. And starting with Reed at the beginning and throughout the course, I think I didn't hear as much as I was hoping about the ethics coming from the corporate sector. And I'm curious to hear thoughts from the panel on if tech is really where the strength is because of the profit motive and the ignoring the externalities. If, in addition to making the tech sector weaker by breaking it up, if there are ways to make other sectors stronger. And in particular, I'm curious because, all 3 of you spent time in the private sector, but now, Brian started a nonprofit, and Laura, sounds like you're moving into the government sector, and I know David does a lot of philanthropy. If there's opportunities to strengthen the other sectors to balance ethical challenges that our tech companies face.
Great, thank you. Last question.
We heard arguments for and against government regulation and self-regulation. And I mean, I'll give some context to my question because government regulation sometimes can be dangerous. An example is when the Spanish government decided to charge copyright from Google for Google News, and Google didn't make a dime on Google News, and that killed all the small guys because Google said, okay, we have to walk out of the country, we can't stay here. So the question is, why can't we have like a mixed model where the companies have to pay some money to an institution, and you have people from the government and also from the industry to represent all aspects and not only one aspect, because sometimes government can be destructive, and companies can also be destructive.
Okay, final words from the panelists, starting on this side. David?
Well, I mean, I by the way, I mostly was making the suggestion that you were making to one path forward. But I would say on the ethics broader question, I would just reflect for a moment. Just because everyone believes that they are behaving in an ethical way, and they may very well be, essentially within a small world ethical, does not mean that the overall behavior of a system becomes ethical. Mm-hmm. And so I think it is, I don't have enough time to explain that thought, but the point is that the behavior of systems needs to be looked at a system level, which is why you can't just assume that a bunch of individual companies, even if everyone is well-intentioned, will create a overall system that we're happy with.
Laura.
Yeah, I think I'll use an example, which is like we as individuals make decisions that are incompatible with our ethics all the time. Like I went into a store and I bought these pants because I liked them and I didn't ask where they were made, in what factory, whether it used ethical labor practices, whether the price I paid for them reflected a value system that I disagree with. And we all make decisions like that on a daily basis because we want, instant gratification. We want to pay less for things. We want whatever it is. And I think that might be what's happening. That's just human nature, and that might be what's happening with these companies as well, and what happens in other industries as well. Which is why which is why the conversation about ethics is not at the forefront, and which is also why it needs to be a kind of collaborative solution.
I would agree. I think collaborative solutions generally create the best outcomes. The one thing that I would throw out there that we didn't talk a lot about tonight is just the fact that these issues that we're facing are on a truly global basis. It's easy enough for us to say, let's work with American lawmakers to make sure Google does the right thing in the United States. But now you have to scale that out to 250, 300 other countries of the world to make sure you're doing the right thing in every part of the world. It's a lot of work, and it's an extraordinarily difficult amount of work for any one company to undertake and to do the right thing. Maybe today is the right day to start, but it's doing this on a global basis is especially difficult.
Well, today is definitely the right day to start. And so by way of concluding, I just want to say 3 thank yous before you applaud. The first is to thank a terrific group of panelists for joining us tonight to help us think through these issues, this reckoning, this moment that we're at from these unique perspectives. The second is to thank all of you for investing your time over the course of our sessions this quarter in engaging seriously what are really hard issues, and frustratingly for many of us, don't have any obvious answers, right? If you felt you were going to come and walk away with the manual for how to address harassment online or the balance between privacy and national security, there is no written manual to send you home with. Instead, really, our exhortation to you is that this is the moment where these issues are being debated, and we need to educate ourselves enough to engage as thoughtful participants in that conversation. So thank you for making that investment in being with us this quarter. And then last but not least, I want to call out and thank Hillary, who has been our guide, our inspirer, our provocateur at the beginning of every session, and the glue that has really brought this course together. And that reflects not only her passionate commitment to these issues and helping to cultivate that kind of conversation, not only in Stanford and the community, but also a sense that individuals can really be agents for change. And so thinking hard about these issues positions all of us to think of ourselves as actors in this ecosystem as opposed to passively accepting the directions that technology may be taking us. So please join me in thanking yourselves and our panelists and Hillary.